Well, it's great to see you all here again, and I just want to introduce the panel so you know who is who. You've heard their names, you've heard their titles. This is Jonquil from Christie's. This is Diana Singer, who is a wonderful jewelry historian, and this is Stephanie Herdrich, who is a curator at the Met and a Sargent expert. And actually a visit with Stephanie and my friend William Lee, who I think is in the audience here, there, is what inspired this whole discussion. And it was actually a portrait of a woman wearing absolutely no jewelry that made me want to know everything about jewelry in portraits. And our goal tonight is quite simple. We never want you to look at a portrait the same way again. We want you to look for the presence of jewelry, to note the materials used in that jewelry, and we also want you to note the absence of jewelry and what that means as well. Where jewelry is used as a symbol of power and access and wealth, and when it becomes a symbol of elegance and restraint and good taste. And that is what we are going to try and conquer this evening. We are limiting our scope to certain periods just because of time, but we want you to take our conversation and think about it at every museum show you go to and every gallery you see. So let's begin with, why not, Queen Victoria. A case study really in portraiture and jewelry. Diana, there are some diamonds here.
Yes, there are definitely some diamonds here. Queen Victoria in this Winterhalter portrait is really at the beginning of the height of her powers. She's 40 years old. She's been on the throne for 20 years, and she pretty much has the whole thing under her belt, so to speak. This portrait is particularly telling because in the background you see Buckingham Palace, which is the geographical seat of her power. In the back right, you see the crown that she wore at her coronation. On the bottom is the Stuart sapphire, which is a 104 carat sapphire. And then right above that—
That's in the crown.
That's in the crown, on the right. And then right above that is the Black Prince's ruby, which had been originally given to the king in 1300, and it was worn in the Battle of Agincourt in the 1400s, and it had been in the British family of rule all those years.
But it's actually a spinel.
But actually, the interesting thing is it is not a ruby, it is a spinel, which is an entirely different stone, even though the color range is the same. So Queen Victoria is wearing, on her right hand, which is on the left in the photograph, she's wearing a turquoise and pearl ring, which was given to her by her beloved husband, Albert. When she met him when she was 20 years old, she wrote to her cousin and said, "He is perfection." And they married the next year, and it was one of the great love affairs of the entire century. So the turquoise represents fidelity, and the pearl represents purity. And it was probably a gift from him because he enjoyed designing jewelry, and he also loved giving her gifts. On her wrist, she is wearing a portrait bracelet that he gave to her prior to their wedding, and there's a portrait of Albert in there, and unfortunately he died of typhoid in 1861, and from that day on, the Queen wore mourning until the day she died, but she never took that bracelet off.
And I think I just want to point to the diamonds, because in the portraits that we'll see later from Jonquil and Stephanie, there's a lot of pearls, there's a lot of colored stones. Mm-hmm. And Queen Victoria was someone who really understood the symbolism of jewelry, both sort of the sentimental symbolism, but also how it spoke to power. Why she is wearing really a significant amount of diamonds. And what's, at this time, sort of, where are diamonds as far as signifiers of power and wealth? Are these likely diamonds from Golconda that had been in the family, or do you think this is sort of a new, because at the sort of end of her reign is when you begin to see diamonds being mined more
from Africa, yes. Well, in this particular photograph, the necklace she's wearing is called the coronation necklace. It has a staggering 161 carats of diamonds. Several of the stones are 11 carats each, and several of them are over 8 carats each. They're mounted in silver, which was the metal of choice at that particular time because platinum was not used extensively until later in the 1800s when the oxyacetylene torch was invented because platinum needs a higher melting point. So these sort of diamonds were always mounted in silver. The diamonds from this particular necklace were obtained from bits and bobs of pieces of jewelry that she had from sword hilts, from scabbards, from other pieces of jewelry, and it was all put together into a necklace for her in 1858 by the court jeweler Garrard and Company. And if you look at her crown, the crown is particularly interesting because the crown was actually made in 1820 for George V for his coronation in a year later. However, the stones did not belong to the English government. The stones were rented from the jeweler Rundell and Company. Queen Victoria made sure that when she got this crown, the stones were hers, and they have stayed there to this very day. And the interesting thing about the crown is...
don't rent, own.
Yes, don't rent, own, exactly. And the shape of the crown is most interesting and most telling about Queen Victoria's power, because you see the croix pâtée, which means the footed cross, which is basically like a Maltese cross. You can see that in 4 stations. But other elements of design that you can't see in the image, but they are nevertheless there, are the symbol of Scotland, which is the thistle, the symbol of Ireland, which is the shamrock, and the symbol of England, which is the Tudor rose. So all of that elements are in between the crosses.
Think about all the messages that are being sent with those symbols, with the fact that that necklace and that crown belong completely to her, and the power that is assumed just by those symbols in the portrait.
Exactly.
This is her, maybe
this is her diamond jubilee.
Not as happy a time, but I think what's important to know about Victoria is as she got older and her dress became quite simple and severe, she always wore her jewelry.
Yes.
She always wore her jewelry.
Yes. She wore widow's jewelry, which at the time was considered appropriate to wear black jewelry, but also pearls and diamonds. Now, if you look at the necklace around her neck, that is the coronation necklace, which is the same necklace from the prior image. However, the pear shape on the bottom is called the Lahore pear shape. It's 22.5 carats, and it was given to her by a Turkish magnate who wanted to thank her for the English assistance during the Crimean War. That's quite the thank you gift.
Yes.
And also the crown at the top of her head, the diamonds used in the crown, perhaps you remember from the prior photograph, she was wearing a brooch along her bodice. She wore quite low-cut bodices until the death of her husband, after which point she never wore low-cut clothing again. But the fringe diamonds on the side of the central pin were taken out of the mountings and used to put in her small crown there, which was sort of like her casual crown.
Sort of low-cut bodices will come up later for sure in Stephanie's talk, but I just want to, I've never heard that pearls and diamonds were considered widow's jewelry.
Usually it was black jewelry.
Right.
But I think as her widowhood wore on over the years, because he did die in 1861,
right.
So she was a widow for many years, I think because she enjoyed jewelry so much, it was considered appropriate to wear these softer colors, softer color pieces.
You know, I was at the Met yesterday, and right before you go into the Sargent gallery, there's a portrait of a woman in mourning. She's an aristocrat, and she is from the island of Puerto Rico, and she is drenched in jewelry. She's all in black, in mourning, but still in jewelry, and it's almost all pearls and diamonds. So I wonder if that sort of idea came through. There's no color in her jewelry except for pearls and diamonds.
Have you heard of the term a merry widow necklace?
No, but tell me.
Well, a merry widow necklace is simply a riviera of diamonds. And the implication being that a woman's husband died and she took the money and just went out and bought herself a wonderful diamond necklace.
My kind of widow. Okay, this is an actual piece of jewelry, which I think we're really using to show just how much jewelry is employed to almost self-brand some of these royals. And here we have, you know, Napoleon in a cameo drenched in diamonds. I mean, that is a signature and a message for the world.
Exactly. This particular type of cameo is called a camé habillé, or in French, a dressed cameo, which means that there's diamonds applied at some point in the cameo. Now, the thing that's most telling about this is it's a portrait in power, not because it's a portrait on canvas, but it's a portrait in jewelry. This is an agate cameo, and you can see how beautifully modeled Napoleon's face is. And you can see the wreath of diamonds around his hair and how beautifully modeled the hair is. But what's particularly interesting here is if you look very closely at his cloak surrounding his neck, there is an N for Napoleon. And if you look even more closely, and it's hard to see in the images, but there are a number of B's set within the diamonds in the cloak. And B's were Napoleon's image. B's are industrious. They are busy, they are productive, they get things done. And for Napoleon, he wanted to find a symbol that harkened back to the origins of the Merovingian dynasty, which was the beginning of France. And in 400 and in 1700 with Clovis, there were conquerors who took the cicada as their symbol, but Napoleon confused the cicada image with that of a bee, and he wanted these things to be the origin of France way before the Bourbon dynasty.
Amazing.
Took it
and
over.
how that sort of him misconstruing this then becomes a part. I mean, there are so many famous Napoleonic patterns of bees.
There are bees in all the fabrics, in the tapestries, in
But
the
there
jewelry,
really,
everywhere.
it was a mistake.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, we're going to shift time periods a little bit and move into Jonquil's world. And as we do, pay attention to the jewelry and how the materials change. I think that's where you really begin to be able to read the secret language we're talking about. Okay, Queen Victoria sort of knew what she was doing with jewelry. Queen Elizabeth I is the master. So Jonquil, tell us about this portrait of Queen Elizabeth I.
Well, I think firstly it's important to say that Elizabeth really understood the importance of subtlety when it came to applying jewels. She went for a very sort of
Just like
specific
a little
more is
stud or
more
something.
approach.
Yeah, she's more from the Stellene Volandes school of jewelry.
I could see you actually in a standing colour. I think we often associate Elizabeth I with pearls.
Yes.
And that was something that she very much encouraged. It's difficult to see from sort of far away in this portrait, but she has pearls in her hair. She has them dripping in ropes around her neck, right down to her waist. And way beyond her waist, because at this point it was really fashionable to have a very low pointing sort of bodice that was very stiff and making a very sort of specific V shape.
Directional.
Directional, and it was to sort of very much show what women were made for, and it was for making dynasties.
Mm-hmm.
And she's also got pearls surrounding, so along those huge sleeves that she has, but then she also has false sleeves that are hanging down the back. You see that sort of wizard look that she has. Those are entirely edged in pearls as well. That skirt, which you can't see, this photograph cuts the bottom of the skirt off, but that skirt is also edged in pearls. Now that's called a drum farthingale, which was very, very popular at this point in the 16th century. And it sort of takes what they would wear a bum roll and have these flounces of fabric, because the more pleats you had in the textile, the more fabric you needed, and these fabrics were incredibly expensive. So I think we think in terms of putting on jewels that in themselves are very costly. The Elizabethans, and indeed in the sort of centuries preceding Elizabeth's reign, they very much thought about the cost of the textile itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would apply jewels, not just sort of, you wouldn't just wear earrings and, pearl necklaces, as many as she has on, and a crown, and also, sort of every sort of individual piece that you would wear. You actually applied them to your clothing itself. So whether they are woven and embroidered into the very fabric of your gown, or they're applied strategically. So you can see each of those jewels has been applied. They would either be pinned or, more likely in this case, stitched onto the gown.
So that whole bodice, there are jewels, those sort of almost, I don't know if they're rosettes or a diamond shape, those are jewels also.
Exactly. Those are jewels that are applied.
So she is bejeweled from absolutely head to toe.
Absolutely head to toe. And this is giving a very specific message. To us, we think about displays of wealth, and that, of course, is incredibly important. She's showing you that she can afford all of this wealth. She's also very subtly, another thing that you can't quite see here, is she's very subtly standing on the world, just in case you had any
questions.
Yes. Yes, I ruled this. But she's sort of making the point that not only can I afford to wear this, but this is my right as the ruler. I wear these things because I'm reflecting the glory of the land that I rule over.
And also the resources that create all these jewels, I own those also.
Exactly. This is how far-reaching I am. I can get rubies from wherever I want. I can get diamonds from wherever I want. I can get that. She's making a very specific point about that. But also in wearing white, we think about her and pearls, and that's because we sort of want to. On the one hand, that's very much about purity. Pearls signified purity, as does the color white, which she's wearing here. But white also signified cleanliness and godliness. And so, white was thought to be, the sort of representing the ethereal light, the light that that was in heaven. And so in dressing herself from head to toe in white, she's making the very specific point that, I am anointed by God as your ruler. And if anyone had any doubts when my father put me in a castle far away and tried to send the line somewhere else after he divorced my mother, no, I'm.
There's a lot she has to say
in
every single portrait.
Yes.
So here are pearls again. So tell us about this, but I do want Diana to also weigh in, because we're going to see pearls pop up again and again in this talk. And I think it's important to understand, jewelry-wise, why they are so dominant in portraiture. But tell us about this
Well, perhaps, should we ask about pearls first?
Sure. Diana,
I'll give a quick 5-minute discussion on pearls. First of all, pearls have been around for thousands and thousands of years. The Greeks and the Romans thought that when Venus, or Aphrodite, depending on whether it was Roman or Greek, arose from the ocean, she shook her hair, and all the droplets of water fell into the ocean. And when they settled on the bottom of the ocean, they turned into pearls. So that is the genesis of the concept of pearls.
There the myth begins.
Yes, there the myth begins. There is a distinction between natural or oriental pearls and cultured pearls. Natural pearls occur when an irritant of some sort works its way into the oyster. And layers of nacre, N-A-C-R-E, is the substance that builds over it. And it's sort of the oyster's way of forming a callus over the irritant. It takes a number of years for natural pearls to grow. And then, of course, they have to be found at the bottom of the ocean. And it's very, very difficult to amass a large quantity of natural pearls. So that's why they've always been considered.
And almost all the pearls we will see people wearing
are oriental
pearls.
Absolutely.
And so you cannot get natural pearls anymore unless you really are at an auction and the prices are astronomical.
Well, they're very much sought after by the Arab market, because they've been worn for centuries by the Arabs. But in the late 1800s, Koichi Mikimoto, a noodle maker from Kyoto, Japan, noticed that the Japanese were spending a lot of money on pearls to wear, and the Chinese were spending even more money on pearls to grind up and use as medicine. So he decided to come up with a way of emulating what the pearls themselves do, and he nucleated the pearls, meaning put a tiny piece of shell into an oyster, and the oyster did what it normally does, and it grew the layers of nacre over the pearls. So in the late 1800s, he formed this process, but it was really only until the 1920s that he had perfected the process to form pure, round, wearable pearls that would be suitable for public consumption.
And those are cultured pearls, and what they do, although they remain expensive, they democratize the pearl market to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
And so now you start to see pearls on sort of, it becomes the symbol of sort of the ladylike fashion, right? Whereas
yes.
Natural pearls, if you know about natural pearls, you know that's really the holy grail.
Yes.
And so when you see these portraits, know that likely they are natural pearls. And also in many places, if you found a pearl, it legally belonged to the king. No matter who found it, it immediately belonged to the king. So think about what that does to the myth surrounding a pearl. It is, by its very nature, royal.
Yes, and speaking of diamonds and pearls specifically, since you brought that up, keep in mind the Industrial Revolution in England, and certainly in the United States. This was the rise of the middle class, and people who had not had money, they now had money, and they wanted to wear jewelry.
Okay, so hold that thought, because
yes.
that goes
okay,
into
fine.
my Sargent thesis.
Absolutely.
That I don't know if it's right at all, that it's my thesis, and so we're all gonna
okay,
go along with it tonight. But it's interesting to think about. So Jonquil, tell us about.
Well, I think before we had the cultured pearls, if you couldn't get your hands on pearls, because to get pearls in these quantities would be tremendously expensive.
Right.
There would be, and frankly, in case you wondered, from Elizabeth's look back there, it did basically involve taking over a country, enslaving everyone that lived there, and then making them produce whatever it was that you wanted. So in the case of pearls, it would be taking ships of slaves out into the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf and sending them down to dive. And this was probably one of the worst forms
right.
of slavery. Divers would last quite often only a couple of days because they would be sent down repeatedly. So you're making a very sort of big statement about what you can afford and what you own.
And the power you have over others, right?
And the power you have over others, exactly. I mean, you had sort of, way before portraits like this, I was reading just this week about Galeazzo Maria Sforza. Now, the Sforza were the ruling signore in Milan in the 15th century. And Galeazzo had this fabulous doublet with embroidered sleeves, and the sleeves alone were embroidered with 3,500 pearls. And so if you couldn't necessarily get your hands on natural pearls, because people like Galeazzo Maria Sforza basically embroidered all of them into his own clothes, there were loads of recipes. So rather than cultured pearls, long before they knew how to do that, they would make false pearls using, there were all sorts of recipes using egg whites and lemon juice, grinding up the teeth of animals to produce the sort of sheen on it. Wolf's teeth. Do see how far you get. Write in.
Egg whites, it's like meringue.
Exactly, just like a meringue. It's difficult to get that sheen, but there were ways of producing. Of producing false gems, basically.
Right. But in these portraits that we're seeing, they're likely the real thing, would you say? Or you're
yes
not?
And no.
Okay.
Yes and no. So, for example, here, this is a portrait by Juan Pantoja de la Cruz, and you see most of those are probably real stones. But it was actually, fine to wear gems that have then been foiled on the back.
Right.
Gemstones would be treated. Even diamonds sometimes. Proper diamonds would be color treated, because it was more about color and about having that real pop when you applied it to your clothing, than always about having the correct stone. Obviously, that was key, and you had to be very specific about whether it was the real thing or not, and you see this in inventories. But you see a lot of these people who appear in regal portraits wearing more jewels than we know that they actually owned in life, according to their own inventories.
Okay.
So therefore, they must be wearing either, false stones for their portraits, or they've loaned them, or they, quite frankly, said to the artist, "You just add a few more."
Right. I mean, that's something that once we get to Sargent, I'd love to know is when these women or the men are sitting for a portrait, how much of the jewelry in the portrait is of their own choice and perhaps reflective of their own taste, and how much of it is selected by the artist the way a stylist might do today in a magazine shoot. I was at the Met yesterday and looking at the Wyndham sisters. It's just majestic and gorgeous, and they each have a different kind of jewelry on. And I wondered if that's Sargent.
I think usually it's the sitter's jewelry. I mean, Sargent was very opinionated about what his sitters wore, and definitely would futz with their clothes and engineer their dresses, and in some cases even just wrap fabric around them to look like a dress.
So he was as much a stylist as...
Absolutely, and he was very opinionated about it. But the jewelry tends to belong to the sitters in most cases. And it's, as you've noticed in many cases, it's also very subtle.
Right.
So,
right.
But you will obviously see certain family members obviously wearing this, sharing pieces and things like that.
Right.
But
okay, we'll get there in a second. But let's look at. I mean, this is a little bit. So when we're looking at this, should we sort of wonder aloud if some of these are natural pearls and some of them are egg whites, basically?
I think occasionally, yes.
Okay.
Sometimes, for somebody like this, you're probably going to have all natural pearls. Sometimes the larger ones are invented, or have either been made to look larger than they are, or are glass, or are these sort of egg white concoctions.
So if we're looking at Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth, we should safely assume all the jewelry is real.
Yes.
As we sort of go lower down the line, we can question some of it.
It depends on the standing of the sitter,
Okay.
and what the jewels are being used for. So, for example, something like this, those are all going to be natural pearls, I would assume. When you're seeing lots of things embroidered, it might be that not all of them are real.
Okay.
But I think what I just wanted to point out here is you can see, in the Renaissance, it wasn't, as I said before, not just about the jewels that you wore, but how they were integrated into your clothes. And this is because it was the effect of light as you were moving.
Right.
On the portrait here, you can see on the edge of her ruff, she's got spangles, which are a sort of sequin, a sort of droplet-shaped sequin. So you have to imagine how these textiles would themselves catch the light, how these things would...
Right, I mean, they're the original filters,
Exactly,
really.
exactly.
They were very much used to sort of reflect softly on the face. Some of them are also used for sound effects, to make someone's presence known before, you sort of maybe realize they were standing next to you. And you see that often in royal portraiture. Even, if you look at sort of Helen of Troy's diadem, a lot of that was around her face to soften her face and also to make sure everyone knew that she was on her way.
Obviously, this is a time also before electric light. It goes without saying, but candlelight and the way that would catch the gems would be spectacular.
Right.
There's one other point about pearls. Pearls are probably the only gem that call attention to the wearer rather than to the gem itself. For example, if you're wearing a spectacular ruby necklace, people will go, wow, look at that ruby necklace. But if you're wearing a fabulous strand of pearls, it's one of the most feminine jewels a woman can wear, and it accents and frames her face, as opposed to calling attention to itself.
Right, so there's a subtlety that will, I mean, I guess it depends how many strands you have on. But I think that subtlety we do see when we start to look at some of Sargent's paintings. So here, I mean, when we're talking about textiles, here are two unbelievable examples. And this is this gold embroidery?
Well, it's brocade.
Okay.
In fact, so even more so, it's crazy to imagine how heavy these textiles would have been. You know,
So
woven with,
it's textiles woven with gold.
exactly. So you have your your warp threads, which are your vertical threads, would be in a silk. And with a colour, if you wanted it to have a colour sheen as well. And your weft threads, which are your horizontal threads, would be genuine metal, genuine precious metal. So your gold is hammered out into a fine sheet like tin foil, and then cut into really, really thin strips, and either woven through itself like that, or wound around a silk core into a thread. And so it's woven into the very textile itself.
Right, so jewelry is not only sort of adornment or afterthought, it is actually sort of throughout the whole statement.
Exactly, and it will affect the way that you move, it will affect the way that you carry yourself. And as you said, this sonorous effect, I mean, we'll see in one of the other slides, but you have aglets. So at this point, your clothes, you don't have zips. You do use buttons, but mostly things are laced together. And if you think about a shoelace with a little sort of point on it, those are called aglets. And those points are to help you thread through the holes in your clothing as you're lacing your sleeves to your bodice, your bodice to your skirts, and that sort of thing. And these points gradually get sort of bigger and bigger and more jeweled and more ornate and heavier. And of course they would make a sort of twinkling sound as you're walking along, or jangling, just as those tiny little spangles on that ruff in the Pantoja de la Cruz.
And are these, what we're looking at, are these paintings, or what's the material? Is this oil that we're looking at? Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Because
So
they're quite saturated too, which is very different once we get to Sargent. I know, Stephanie, you also want to talk about how the technique he used to paint jewelry. And this is almost the polar opposite of that, right?
this is definitely oil piled and piled.
Yeah.
To give you
Like the jewelry.
Exactly.
I mean, if you look at, is that textile around his neck, or are those gold chains around his neck?
Those are gold chains around his
chains,
neck.
okay.
And in the Renaissance, gold chains were often given as gifts at court. So if you were, sort of a particular high standing, the monarch might give you a set of gold chains, if you were an ambassador, and things like that. So you find that people wear these in their portraits very prominently. I mean,
So I think it's interesting now. I mean, when you look at a Renaissance portrait and someone is wearing multiple gold chains, you sort of understand that that is a clear symbol that they were favored.
Exactly.
Do rings work the same way?
Rings can work the same way, but they may also be, things that have been gifts. They may be family rings. So something like this, where you see them really stacked up, it's probably a very strong symbol of dynasty.
Okay.
So she's showing the families that she comes from. But
It's amazing. I mean, this whole idea of a ring on every finger and stacked is quite sort of in the current climate. At Gucci certainly has brought that back.
Absolutely, it's fun to look at them because you see what people are trying to show you in the fact that at this point, people wore gloves all the time, partly because it's always cold, but also because you can't just casually go and wash your hands all the time when you don't have running water.
Yeah.
But also your flesh, needed to be very, very pure white and soft. You didn't show much flesh, so what you did show needed to count.
Okay.
So if you're not wearing gloves in your portrait, the things that you choose to wear on your hands, which are bare, is very important.
Okay.
But what you see
So in some Renaissance portraiture, will we see gloves on hands? Okay.
you do. And
So if someone is not wearing gloves, they clearly they're just telling something to the world.
well, yes and no. I think what's interesting is when they choose to wear gloves, because gloves themselves were expensive and were quite often perfumed. And if you go to the Met and look at some of the portraits also by Cranach there, you will see some of the sitters wearing gloves that are slashed at the knuckles. And
Amazing.
you slash at the knuckles so that you've got sort of better articulation and things. But then they're also on certain fingers slashed below the knuckles, and it's basically so that you can show off all of your rings even when you've got your gloves on.
I'm rich, to be clear.
Yes,
Okay.
in case you hadn't guessed.
Okay, I just want to get to this portrait. And Jonquil and I both love this portrait. It is going to be a part of a show that is opening at the Frick on the 20th or the 21st.
That's, I think, the 21st.
And,
I'm missing the opening tonight to be with you. He's my favourite artist, so you should know.
So it is Giovanni Battista Moroni, and I will tell you that when you go to the Frick to see this show, look at the jewelry. It is remarkable, and a lot of it is woven gold jewelry.
Exactly, and that the reason I chose this portrait is, again, to go back to that idea of not just wearing earrings, crowns, bracelets and things, but the way that your everyday, and I say everyday, obviously if you're at court, these are not every day for everyone, but the way that jewels and precious metals are incorporated into the other objects that you're wearing. So my favourite thing about this portrait of Isotta, which is a great name, is she's wearing around her neck a sable. Now, sables are, it's a sort of fur, it's kind of like a big ferret, and they were prized in the Renaissance because it doesn't matter which way you stroke the pelt, it doesn't have an against the grain, so to speak. So it's beautiful and soft whichever way you stroke it. And it was incredibly, incredibly soft. So then it became this status symbol, not just to wear something that's trimmed or lined in sable, because how is anyone else going to know that it's sable from a distance? Only you know. So then they would start wearing them with these bejeweled heads and paws. And what's really wonderful, and I don't want to spoil the surprise, but if it helps any of you who are more interested in jewels than in paintings to go to the Frick, in the exhibition, I was promised, are going to have one of the jeweled heads from these sables. The sable is long since disintegrated, but the jeweled head still exists.
No, that's in the sort of release about it. So, I mean, she has on also several different materials too. There's pearls. There look like there's some colored stones as well. There's a colored bead. So there too, in the Renaissance, you begin to have access to different materials, and more importantly, an appreciation of different materials.
Exactly. I think she's also, that fan that she has, there has been discussion as to whether it's...
There you
wonderful.
go.
Yeah, there you can see that jeweled
the
head.
bejeweled ferret.
And wearing a girdle as well, these chains that you would wear around your waist, to accentuate that line of the bodice, but also you would hang things from this girdle. So you attach your your sable to it, not that it's about to run away, but you not after everything you've laden on it. But you would also have everyday things that you might need. You'd have a pomander, which is filled with a sort of jeweled sphere that would be filled with spices and oils that would sort of brush in your skirts as you walked and give off a nice scent, because people probably didn't smell very nice. But
it's interesting to see that anywhere a jewel could be placed or opulence could be displayed, it was. There was not an ounce, an inch that was not used to express ostentation and access and wealth.
Precisely. Not just as a sort of look how wealthy I am, but as a very sort of strong message to say this is what is produced where I am from, and
I have dominion over that. Okay, so I just let's just sort of all note this shift. It's many years, but still. Think about Queen Victoria, think about Queen Elizabeth, think about the gold and the pearls and the stones around their necks, in their hair, and then embroidered throughout their clothing. And then let's move to the one and only Madame X, Stephanie.
I mean, where to start with this? Yes, the difference in the amount of jewels is very
Can you
obvious.
give us a date on this?
So this is 1884, 83,
Okay.
84, so we've gone forward 300 years. And we've looked at a lot of portraits of royalty. Madame X, who was Virginie Avignon-Gautreau, was an American from Louisiana who moved to Paris when she was a small child. Her father dies during the Civil War. And her mother basically marries her into French society. And she
No, it's just the question.
Oh,
So keep going.
she marries a banker and kind of launches herself in French society. And she's known for her elaborate couture gowns, the way she presents herself, which has really nothing to do with jewelry at all. So she is very into her alabaster skin, and we know she powdered herself with lavender powder. Some people say there's some evidence that she ingested arsenic regularly to make her skin more transparent. And she apparently felt that jewels detracted from her skin.
But there is jewelry.
There
in this
is
portrait.
jewelry. So, I mean, we will obviously talk about those shoulder straps, the sort of jeweled straps. But I wanted to talk first about the little hair ornament, which is very difficult to see. I hope you can see that little dab on the top of her head. You all, of course, should come to the Met and look at her up close. So she's wearing a little kind of diamond crescent moon in her hair. And Sargent paints it as just these dabs of a brushstroke. And this association, the crescent moon with Diana, the goddess of the hunt, was a popular motif in the late 19th century associated with beauty. And this was sort of Gautreau's signature. She appears in other images wearing the same crescent. She appears in the a print in the press. So that association is kind of very powerful. The dress is a bit unusual for the period. There's so many people who have spent a lot of time studying it, and supposedly it was by Worth, but we've never seen anything like it. And particularly the bareness of that décolletage and the plunging nature. So there has been theories that the dress itself was that was sort of a bustier that was not meant to be worn by an ordinary person. It's more something an actress would wear. And there has been a theory that those by Anna Reynolds, a mutual friend of ours who's a curator at the Royal Collection in London, that Sargent actually simply draped bracelets over her shoulder to become the straps. So it's just a theory.
And after you hear that, especially the one where and that's the original where the
Right.
strap has fallen off and it was a scandal.
Exactly. So,
It really looks like a bracelet.
I mean, and the whole construction of the dress is kind of funny. We can't tell from how Sargent paints it because he paints very broadly and just dabs, and he wants it to sparkle. But I think it's such an interesting theory. And then the other, obviously, we talked about earlier, the only other jewelry she has on is a wedding ring. So, which is also just the merest dab of gold paint. And I'm sure that's
significant.
Significant because so much about who she was and how she appeared was considered scandalous. And I think that the ring was a definite,
Nod to respectability.
yes,
Yeah.
for what it's worth.
So this is Mrs. Carl Meyer and her children. I know it's one of Stephanie's favorites. It has become one of mine. And here we have pearls again.
Pearls and pearls and pearls.
Yeah.
And this portrait to me is just, we're looking at some outliers in Sargent's work because this painting is so extravagant in every way. Mrs. Carl Meyer was the wife of a banker, again. So this is painted in the 1890s. So in London, where Sargent is living. And, she is not descended from lines of aristocrats or royalty. This is a time in London where society is shifting and people's wealth and status is not just based on the land or the title that they have, but this is a kind of nouveau...
Industry.
Right, it's industry. And so these are people who are newly arrived in society, launching themselves, and a portrait by Sargent is a wonderful way to do that. She's also Jewish in a time in London where there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. So there are kind of nasty comments in the press that say things like, oh, a few £1,000s is not a lot to pay for social status. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're directly linking the portrait with an increase in status. in any case, I mean, she's wearing this amazing gown, which is sort of taffeta and silk, like a cream puff in these pastel colors, a total French style, as is all the furniture, this kind of French settee. Everything about it is indicating her taste for French 18th century furniture was very much in vogue. The dress evokes, you know, like Boucher or Fragonard. So there's this whole linking. And then the pearls, which if you want to go to the...
really see.
It's hard to see.
Actually, on Stephanie's Instagram, you did that sort of slideshow where she takes you through, and the pearls go all the way down to the floor.
Do we have that?
Do we? Oh, yes, we do.
So
there we go.
It's hard to see. So you see this is one strand of pearls wrapped around her neck a few times.
And these would be natural pearls.
Natural pearls, all the way down to her waist, where they seem to be tucked below the sash of her dress, and then down all the way the front to her toes, where they're so long they actually pool at her feet, which is quite astonishing, I think. And just the opulence of that is kind of...
Given that this is such a departure from Sargent, and it's in the other work we'll see, is it commentary at all on her desire for social status and maybe a little too hungry for social status?
I think so. I think, I mean, everything, as I said, is over the top. That dress is so flamboyant. She was flamboyant. She was known for being a very vivacious hostess. She was very involved in the arts and social causes. I mean, she was someone who was known in society. But I don't want to say it's a little desperate, but maybe a little. You know, it's so out there. And if we, you know, the whole, can you go back one?
Yes,
if we think about the composition too, the way Sargent takes this bird's eye view looking down and everything's tilted, I think it's kind of disquieting. And for people who might have seen it at the Royal Academy in London, here is this newly arrived woman in society, and she looks as if she's going to jump off the canvas and kind of launch herself. I'm here. I mean, the portrait itself was met with great success and appreciation, but with also these little kind of catty comments.
Where is this now?
This is at the Tate.
Okay.
It was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Some of you may have seen it at the Jewish Museum in a wonderful little show that highlighted the family.
So let's sort of look at this, and because this is sort of nearing where I think a question that I wanted to ask through this is, if we look at the portrait we just saw and look at the Renaissance portraits and the ostentation and extravagance that was used to express and symbolize wealth, suddenly when you have this new age of aristocrats, they're not royal, but certainly they're a ruling elite, and Sargent is their painter, he is the author of the idea of themselves, and jewelry gets so quiet. And it's also at this time, which Diana pointed to, that the Industrial Revolution is creating much more wealth, and suddenly not only do people have much more money to buy jewelry, but you begin to have a jewelry industry that is making more jewelry. So the idea of a court jeweler or you know, a sort of small jeweler that only very, very wealthy people had access to, you suddenly see the rise of brands like Tiffany or Castellani or Lalique. And so suddenly jewelry becomes much more accessible. So my question is then, does less jewelry suddenly become a symbol that you had the real money and the real taste?
I think it's a really good hypothesis in some instances, and someone like Lady Agnew, I think, is much more confident in her status, her situation, the property she and her husband own. We don't know a lot about her, but she actually did not have very much jewelry, and it's thought that this beautiful necklace pendant that she's wearing was a locket that her fiance gave her when they got engaged. So a very...
Do we have any, is that a cameo? Do we have a sense of
you know, it's very hard to say. It looks like there's some turquoise and maybe some pearls on it, but because Sargent is much more interested in kind of broadly representing the sparkle, it's hard to say.
Okay.
Her only jewelry in her inventory was this locket. So, and she is wearing a gold bracelet as well, right? But there's just no other jewelry. Everything about it, if you compare it to Mrs. Meyer too, is so much more subdued. The very plain dress, which, you know, the plain white dress with the lavender sash, harkens back to something like Reynolds or something very kind of stately and sedate. Even her pose, kind of, she was sort of sickly her whole life, but sitting back in the chair, relaxed, she just seems kind of confident in her position and less eager than I would say
She doesn't
Mrs.
seem
Meyer.
as posed as Mrs. Meyer.
Well, and she whispers money, right?
I mean, it is very relaxed. It's very, the gaze, which is so, I think, direct and kind of steady, you know, has a kind of naturalism about it that Mrs. Meyer does not have.
Right. No pearls to the floor here. And then here we have Isabella Stewart Gardner, an amazing patron of the arts. And I have never seen that portrait of her in Venice. That is a major necklace she has on.
That is a major necklace. And I think it's actually the same jewels that she's wearing in the portrait by Sargent. So we have Sargent on the left, Anders Zorn on the right. And these are both paintings at the Gardner Museum. And I think this is a long pearl necklace that has this ruby pendant on the end. And in the Sargent portrait, I think she's basically wrapped it around her waist. Okay. And I was so glad that you showed the Moroni with the, you know, the chains at the waist and this kind of all of these Renaissance motifs. If you've been to the Gardner Museum, you know it's housed in an Italian Renaissance style palazzo, which Gardner built in Venice. So she was very much interested in all things Renaissance, collected Renaissance art. And so in the portrait by Sargent, they're kind of drawing on all of this symbolism as a way of self-image and self-fashioning. So you know, the brocade is a scrap of Venetian fabric from her collection, which Sargent enlarged and put behind her. So instead of the Moroni, when it's woven on the dress, she's set up against it. She's got this pearl. She was known to have a very svelte figure with a small waist. So here Sargent accentuates it in this very unconventional way. I mean, can you think of other examples of people wearing pearls around their waist?
No, not specifically.
Yeah. So she was also flamboyant and extravagant and unconventional. And
you certainly see that in the portrait from Venice.
Exactly. And you know, I think the two artists are sort of playing off each other also, because Sargent shows her very sedate. One critic said like a haloed icon in a Byzantine painting. And Zorn does the exact opposite, shows her really exuberant personality as she bursts off the balcony in her palazzo in Venice. But I liked that the necklace, which I think was a kind of signature piece for her.
Right, and there, you know, going back to our question of whether Sargent had his sitters sort of choose their own jewelry or whether it was very much sort of his choice, this is obviously a piece of her own that she wore often.
Exactly, yeah.
Now we move, I mean, let's just again sort of look at this, you know, an amazing wealthy woman, patron of the arts, and then we move to Marjorie Merriweather Post, who is, now we're sort of going back to Queen Victoria a little bit here with the jewelry. One amazing thing to note, Stephanie this morning sent us, that little girl there is Dina Merrill. And in Hillwood, which is Marjorie Merriweather's Post's home in DC, which I really urge you to all go. It's an amazing house museum, and it is an amazing place to test out this theory because there are so many portraits of powerful women, beginning with Catherine the Great, who, if anyone knew how to use jewelry to signal power, it was Catherine the Great. And Marjorie Merriweather Post was a great fan of Catherine the Great. There's Catherine the Great memorabilia all around the house. And here she is, I think, in some ways, imitating Catherine the Great, especially with the emeralds. That's Cartier, is that right?
Yes, Cartier London,
Yeah.
yes.
Cartier London is a very jewelry thing to say.
Well,
right?
there's
there's sort of Cartier Paris. There's Cartier London.
Yes.
It's a real sort of secret jewelry language. But so this is Cartier London.
Yes, this is Cartier London.
Yes. Okay.
The piece that she's wearing at her shoulder was originally made in 1923. Marjorie Merriweather Post purchased it in 1928. Now, it was originally part of a much larger piece of jewelry. It was a sautoir, which is a long, long necklace, and it was a series of lump emeralds that terminated here. And the pin that you see was actually a pendant that hung underneath, and she wore it to a ball in Palm Beach in the 1920s, and she decided at a later point in time that she wanted to be able to wear it as a brooch. So the top of the pin was originally a semicircular pave diamond set section, but Cartier took that off and they put that sort of belt-shaped top on it so that she could wear it both as a pin and as a pendant. There are 250 carats of emeralds in here. The largest emerald in the center has an engraving in Farsi or Persian on it, which says, servant of Shah Abbas, who was a potentate in the Persian area in the 1600s. Engraving on stones like this was meant to bring additional power to the stone. And of course, the green symbolizes life, and it symbolizes the color of Mohammed's turban, and it was considered a very, very powerful color. In Indian jewelry, the Indian jewelers don't care if an emerald is flawed. They do care if it's large. So in this particular case where you have 250 carats of emerald, the fact that they're large is very, very relevant. And many of them are fluted or carved beads because this is used to cover up the jardin or the inclusions in the emeralds, although these emeralds are particularly clear.
I just also want to note the date on this. This is 1929. So, you know, historically, this is a moment where people are the lavish, again, we're sort of in a period where lavish displays of wealth become quite important until, you know, obviously we know what happens next. But, you know, also I think it's important to note that Catherine the Great, just if you go to Hillwood, you'll see sort of, Marjorie Merriweather Post was just absolutely enthralled with Catherine the Great, and Catherine the Great believed emeralds gave her power. Before she had an important meeting with her generals, she always said she put emeralds on. It's one of my favorite jewelry stories, and I can't help but think that given how much she knew about Russian history, that also figured into this.
Oh, that must have figured into it. And on her finger, she is wearing what is probably the Emperor of Mexico emerald. It was the first piece of jewelry that she bought for herself after her father died. And it's a 21 karat gem emerald. It's now at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington.
Incredible. So our last, here she is again with an amazing sapphire and diamond necklace. This also is Cartier?
Yes, this is also Cartier. The necklace was it was not born like this. It was originally 2 bracelets that she had bought at Textiles, which was a store in New York City. And it's not clear whether she tired of the bracelets or she just wanted to make a change. But her husband at the time, Joseph Davies, had become ambassador to Russia in 1936. And she wanted to go to Russia giving off a certain impression. She left a lot of her more ostentatious jewelry in the United States during the course of their tenure. And she had this piece made to bring to Russia. The center sapphire is a 38 karat Burma sapphire. Burma sapphires tend to be a very rich, saturated, inky blue, as opposed to the more pastel blue that you see in a cashmere stone. So it's a good focal point for this necklace. And Cartier took the 2 bracelets from Textiles, and they made it into this necklace. And the center sapphire, the 38 karat stone, can come out and be worn as a clip. There are over 100 carats of sapphires in the necklace, and there are 65 carats of diamonds. So it's a good piece of jewelry to show that you're powerful, but not trying to prove too much. It's subtle. It's obnoxiously subtle.
But most importantly, to note how jewelry is used as both expression and then reaction to that expression of wealth, Stephanie this morning sent us a picture of Dina Merrill that hangs at Hillwood, and she is dressed as Madam X with absolutely no jewelry on. And so think about, this is your mother who chooses to take portraits in, 25 karat emeralds, in Burmese sapphires, in natural pearls, and you choose to have your portrait done as Madam X with absolutely nothing but a black dress.
Can you go back one?
Yeah.
Because when I look at that, I think, oh gosh, is that a portrait of the brooch or she's competing? She's really competing with the daughter.
Yeah.
I
Child's
mean,
lost.
the child is lost. So maybe that's not to analyze her, but
Right. No, I
could
mean,
wonder.
Jewelry, can get you on the couch for sure. But I think what I hope that you have seen is that jewelry always, as I say every time on this stage, is an expression of the time in which it was created. And it is not something that is a cloistered world or should be kept in a vitrine. It is a cultural artifact as much as anything else. And when I look at portraits with this panel of experts, I am convinced of that more than ever. And I hope when you look at portraits from now on, you will take note of the jewelry, think about what was happening when that piece was created, who ruled, what lands they had conquered, what was going on in the world that they might want to respond to, but also note where it is absent. And I said that when I met with Stephanie I guess it's about 6 months ago, where I really thought to do this panel was in a portrait at the Met of a woman named Catherine Wolfe. She was the richest unmarried woman in New York. She was the greatest benefactor of the Met. She is painted with a beautiful satin dress lined in mink or sable, and there is not one stitch of jewelry. And to me, that speaks as much as if she had on all the natural pearls of Elizabeth I. That is a monumental shift in an expression of power and wealth. So there are some questions, and there are a few good ones. So we're going to do 2 questions, and then, okay. If you had your portrait painted, what jewelry would you wear?
Oh my God.
All right, Diana.
Well, if I had my portrait painted, I inherited a piece of jewelry from my grandmother. My family has been in the jewelry business for 3 generations, and my grandfather bought this from my grandmother, and it's called an automaton. It is about this big, and it's an image of the sun smiling with a halo around it, and then there are stars around it. When you move the lever, all the little arms interact with each other and they move. And the automaton doesn't keep time. It doesn't really serve any purpose whatsoever. It just is a thing of extraordinary beauty. And it's orange and yellow and gold, and the diamonds are set in silver, so there's the softness of the silver with the diamonds. And for me, that brings back the thought of my whole family and how we've been in the business for 3 generations, and that would be the piece I would want to have
So it
with
would
me
be
as a
sort
portrait.
of a Queen Victoria approach, sort of there's a sentimentality
Absolutely,
to it.
yes.
Jonquil, you want to?
Well, I think I'd go for the jewels in textiles, and where, maybe,
I
maybe
could
this is obviously solid cloth of gold.
Yes, it's solid. Spun in Flanders.
Yes, naturally. So I think I'd probably go wild with the clothes, and then do what I quite often tend to do, which is wear vintage Bakelite.
We
a
love
massive
Bakelite.
pair of earrings.
Love Bakelite. Stephanie, what about a favorite jewel from a painting?
Oh, I mean, I'm a fan of Lady Agnew's necklace.
Yeah.
Just there's something so elegant and also mysterious and simple. And I think I would go Catherine Wolfe in my portrait. Just leave people guessing and wondering.
I don't know, you're
Yeah.
wearing that ring tonight.
Yeah,
so,
well.
yeah. Well, I thank you all and for indulging me in this hypothesis, and I think that I hope our goal has been achieved, and that you walk through museums and galleries jewelry spotting forever. So thank you again, and thank you to this amazing panel of women.